Across the Margin. Across the Margin podcast.
Welcome to Across the Margin, the podcast, where we take you beyond the margin, behind the scenes of the magazine, and deeper into the stories. I am your host, Michael Shields, and usually this is the point where I introduce my co-host, Chris Thompson, but Chris could not join us. We'll get him back for the next one, of course, but we do have a very special podcast for you today, as recently I had the unique pleasure to talk to Ben Selkow, the writer, producer, and director of Buried Above Ground, a documentary that explores with acumen and delicacy the mental health condition that so many people deal with, that is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Ben is a very talented filmmaker. He's an award-winning New York-based filmmaker whose work has been exhibited on HBO, CNN, and the Sundance Channel. His varied credits include Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown, series such as Welcome to Fairfax and Get to Work, the documentaries Prayer for a Perfect Season, Rising, Rebuilding Ground Zero, The Carrier, and Summer in the Cage, which won the 2009 Mental Health America Media Award. Ben was also a mental health journalism fellow at the Carter Center, which is an institute founded by former President Jimmy Carter and his wife, activist Rosalind Carter. Ben is a socially conscious filmmaker who, through all these experiences and after his work on Buried Above Ground, is the ideal person to talk to come to better understand PTSD. Buried Above Ground took over 6 years to make, and over that time, Ben amassed a depth of knowledge about this condition that so many people are facing daily. The statistics are astounding. 450 million people, or 8% of the population of the world, develop PTSD at some point in their life. And PTSD isn't limited to those who have taken part in combat, and Buried Above Ground brings this to light. Buried Above Ground is a revelatory and important film. It contributes to reshaping the way our society thinks about mental health issues and helps dispel the myths and misconceptions about PTSD. It is set to air June 28th at 8 p.m. on public television's World Cinema. So go ahead and mark your calendar on that one. It's fantastic. I couldn't recommend this documentary more. It truly affected me deeply, and I believe that will be the case with you. And I also I have no doubt you'll enjoy this interview with Ben. It's a good one. So enjoy. I have with me today Ben Selkow, who is the director, producer, and writer of Buried Above Ground, a film that follows three people attempting to recover from post-traumatic stress disorder. Thank you for joining me today, Ben.
Thanks for having me.
Really, really appreciate you making the time. So this film, your film, is the tagline, hauntingly reads, "What if the worst thing that ever happened to you felt like it was still happening?" Which that's a pretty intense thought to think about. And as I said, it follows three people trying to recover from PTSD. One is Louis, an Iraq war veteran. Another is Aranita.
It's Luis.
Okay.
And Arandina.
Okay, Arandina.
Arandina.
Yep. And the third is Ashley,
Yep.
and she's an evacuee from Hurricane Katrina. And Buried Above Ground explores the subjects' lives for 6 years and their personal battles uncovered illuminate a global health condition that is misunderstood, underreported, and often left untreated. So what stands out to me right away there is the 6 years thing. This must have been a pretty intense experience and a labor of love for you. I'm real curious. What motivated you? What got this started for you?
All those are apt descriptions of the process. I became interested in post-traumatic stress disorder in 2008. I had just finished another documentary on another mental health condition called bipolar disorder, and that film was called A Summer in the Cage. And as I was touring with that film, doing community screenings, pairing with mental health advocacy groups nationally, it also coincided with where we were in the Iraq War and in our engagements in Afghanistan as well. And after multiple deployments, soldiers starting to come home, and so the Veterans Administration, our government, Department of Defense, State Department, all of the kind of governmental institutions starting to really grapple with the consequences of multiple deployments and combat, as manifested through post-traumatic stress disorder in their veteran population, and how to manage it just as a psychiatric condition, but also the huge numbers that were coming back.
Yeah, there was like it was a moment in time where there was an overwhelming number that they had to address, and so it
remains an overwhelming.
Yes.
In terms of access to treatment, the time and efficacy in which the VA processes disability claims, how they award their those claims, prescribe medication. It's still an ongoing thing that needs to be addressed. Yeah. So I became interested in, as part of this national conversation around PTSD in veterans, and I was had been working since 2000 on a film about mental health conditions. So I was sensitive to that generally. As I started to investigate PTSD further, I realized that we all associate with war and soldiers and something that's been around forever. And
but that's not the only origin of the issue. Yeah,
precisely. I read a book called Trauma and Recovery, which was written by a psychiatrist and noted author and lecturer named Judith Herman, and it really came out of the feminist movement of the 70s, looking at domestic violence and child abuse, and really understanding that, wait a minute, there's this whole category of trauma survivors with lingering effects as manifested in post-traumatic stress disorder that there is no public record for. You go to war, we watch CNN, the validation of the traumatic event is there. With domestic violence and domestic violence and child abuse,
nobody thinks about the term PTSD linked with those. I didn't.
Yeah, it's emerging. You don't. You think, okay, well. And also, you don't. There's no witness to it, so it's he said, she said, and it's and there's a power dynamic in that thing. There's overwhelmingly women are the subject of domestic violence, and children. Again, their voices are drowned, they're silenced. Yeah. So as I started to understand PTSD in a broader context, I realized, wait a minute, there's a huge population with no voice to this. Yeah. I want to look at that, and then as I continued to research PTSD, I found that. Oh, wait a minute. You get it from first responders, get it. Police officers get it. Firemen, firewomen get it. People who have witnessed a traumatic event in a civilian context. Yeah. Car accidents, natural disasters. So all of a sudden, there's all these other categories going on. I said, wait a minute. Okay, how do I broaden this storytelling and look at these other communities where we don't necessarily associate PTSD with, and so then it became the process of casting people to fulfill that role. And so I wanted to use the story of war as the main entry point to understanding PTSD, and war as a metaphor for trauma, and look at other traumatic instances in America and see what these other populations would look like.
Where the film was so successful in that it did show multiple ways in which this affects. I mean, I never thought of natural disasters, and then you showed the Hurricane Katrina and how it affects people afterwards. I was blown away by that. So.
I mean, if you compare, what New Orleans looked like, and that was, it was an analogy that meant, it looked like a war zone.
Absolutely.
From the helicopters in the sky to the burning fires to the, to bodies and smells in the streets. It looked like that. Yeah. And again, it's not just Katrina. It was, one of the largest natural catastrophes we've had, or man-made catastrophes, if you look at it.
Yeah.
But if you think about the incidents of tornadoes, heavy storms, and fires, those are things that happen. Seasonally in our country all the time, and those are communities where mental health is not necessarily a part of the initial triage. I think that's changing, but you associate, someone's house got blown away, they got shelter to worry about.
They're basically worrying about the basic necessities at that point, not the lingering effects.
Right, exactly.
And I was blown away that one of the numbers that shows up early is that 450 million people are. In their lifetime will be struggling with this, and you pointed out that it's 8% of the world population. Did this whole thing change your worldview of how how many people are suffering out there? And do you look at things differently?
I think about it a lot. I think about when we look at the international question. Where you do a film like this and you want to think about the issues it raises, but then you want to think forward. Okay, what is it projecting into, and what do we need to, what is the cautionary tale? And so I think about a number of things internationally. Who are the most vulnerable populations internationally? Women and children, right? Yeah. Okay, so what's happening in the world? You've got global conflict, so we know war is going to create trauma. But then we think about like climate change and the number of populations, the density of populations along waterways, and we're having rising coastlines. So, and those are generally poor people, and that's going to, so there's the impact of, perhaps a tsunami. But then there's also just the issue of displacement or forced displacement, forced migration. And
people who don't have access to water, some of that has already begun, don't have access to water, are moving around forward. And the war over water in a lot of ways has started. And then there's the trauma associated with everyone having to deal with that.
Absolutely.
It's so intense.
No, you just saw the headline in the New York Times, a couple days ago, just talking about, people having to use transactional sex to survive as displaced people in the Syrian refugee crisis. And so, that's just one instance where trauma is incurred, but you're in camps without supervision, children moving from here to there. And mental health is not a part of, for the most part, unless an NGO goes in, mental health is not, again, the basic necessities are addressed, food, water, shelter. But mental health, if not kind of intervened at an early stage, produces those lingering effects. The lingering effects produces behavioral changes that create all kinds of things, from substance abuse to depression, anxiety, all of the things that the negative consequences in behavioral health that are associated with that come as a rise. And so I look at like the international question really, as a place to look in the future. How do we look at how we intervene international crises, and climate change being a big part of that conversation.
Mm-hmm. We did just mention the multiple angles you took at it. I'm just curious, as a filmmaker, how did you come upon these subjects? How did you isolate them? A little behind the scenes I'm looking for.
Sure, of course. No, the casting process, the casting couch. Well, the casting couch looks a little different in documentaries.
Sure.
And for me, I really benefited. Like I said, my previous film was on mental health. And again, it was a 6-year study of someone with bipolar disorder. And it gained a lot of credibility, within the documentary world. It was, it was on Sundance Channel, but also within the mental health community. I think that, some of the national advocacy groups really embraced it and felt like it was a really poignant, accurate, and sympathetic telling of a story. So I've been entrusted with telling vulnerable stories, especially around mental health. So when I was looking for, people to cast in the film, I was in touch with various therapists that I had met along the way, and put it out there that I was looking to meet trauma survivors, specifically with PTSD, to do a new film. And so a number of therapists suggested people that they thought were ready in their kind of therapeutic arc to talk.
To discuss it, yeah.
That they had reached some level of stabilization in their personal life, had a desire to talk about it, because that's not uncommon that, especially with trauma,
they withdraw.
Would be withdraw, but then once you've reached some level of stabilization, is in a way to make sense of what has happened to you, advocacy becomes a route or part of something they want to do.
Yeah, you see that in your film as well. Yeah.
That like, okay, what I don't want anyone else to suffer the way I did. Yeah. B, how do I justify this life experience? It was so horrific. Yeah. How do I make some good come of it? And so advocacy often becomes a route
into something positive. Yeah.
Totally. So that in part this was not a straight advocacy film, but people were willing to talk. People were willing to talk to me because I had a track record dealing with vulnerable populations around mental health, and then it was up to me to kind of earn the trust, and that became the biggest challenge, is because the biggest casualty in PTSD is trust. You lose trust in yourself, institutions, people, friends, family, and so that fissure in trust, forces you to isolate. So restoring that trust in a brief period, and then extending it beyond to say, hey, can I follow you in your personal life? Can I come into your therapy session? Can I ask you questions? Can I ask you about the past?
Very intimate, experiences.
Imagine if I sat here and asked you, like, Mike, I want you to tell me about your childhood.
Yeah.
That's a big ask.
Yeah, absolutely. So. And then it's going to be broadcast out there too. It's something you need to make sure the person's going to be presenting you in this positive light, or the way you're hoping to see him. Luis, he did say, just like you're saying, at one point, being in Iraq, literally he could trust no one. And to go back to your tagline, imagine taking that home where literally you can trust no one. And he was talking about being in a room with Iraqis, whether it's families, and he was like, smile, be nice, but always be ready with a plan to kill everyone in the room. And this is, he's coming home with this, and that's where it was pretty intense that you delved into his thinking, because he was a warrior. He was strong. I mean, you could see him in the beginning of the film. He's talking about how proud he is, but then he became broken. And doesn't that make you feel this can just happen to anybody?
Well, I mean, I think that's precisely right. I mean, I think that's, well, first of all, I would say he's still a warrior.
Yes,
I know you did, but I'm saying that, like, he's warrior for 17 years in the U.S. Army, but he's very much a warrior now, and arguably has to deal with a lot more pain, mental and physical, day to day. And his choice is to carry his mission forward, which is one of advocacy, awareness. It's a really selfless thing. I mean, he's out there 3 to 4 times a week, reading his book, sharing his service dog, and really promoting an idea of the recovery, light, hope is all available to someone with a lot more obstacle to it. But to he's, you're right. I mean, he's a warrior. So the idea in terms of using the film to battle the effects of negative stigma around mental health is saying this dude, his nickname in the Army was Captain America. When he was a sergeant, he was a lieutenant, so he's a platoon commander. He's the guy that could lift the most, but also like the most tactically prepared, strategically prepared.
He's a sharp man.
Very, very smart, very prepared, physically fit, ethical beyond belief, disciplined beyond belief. And so all of these things say, okay, so if literally Captain America can be broken psychologically by this war, then okay, maybe I can go talk to someone, because I don't have to be ashamed or embarrassed or feel like I'm weak, or all those negative terms that come around from negative stigma. Someone like Luis is someone who says like, well, no, I can go. I need help. I need to go get help.
It's empowering.
It's empowering, and then you also understand that like, you also don't have to settle. You don't have to be resigned to victimhood of patient, of victim, of the pathology of a psychiatric condition. You can find your way out of it. I mean, you need help, resources, and people.
But it's possible.
It's totally possible. It's completely possible.
Yeah. He mentioned that when he returned, I think this was from his first tour, because he did multiple tours. Right?
2 tours, yeah.
2 tours. That he didn't even have an outlet for talking to a therapist. He was taking it out on his family for not being able to help, which is neither their fault. But this is kind of one of the points of your films. I assume something you probably came upon often is the lack of help and options of those with PTSD.
Well, and obviously, I think the Army's culture, the military's culture is shifting. So there's more awareness, more interventions available, but there's still a stigma that prevails of strength and weakness on one level. On the other hand, the perception that you're going to hurt your military career if there's something in your file about seeking help for depression, anxiety.
Is that something that is a roadblock for them to getting help?
Absolutely. Yeah. No.
I've not thought about that.
Yeah. If a guy's a career guy, or whether he's an enlisted person or a commissioned officer, people talk, and it's a subjective thing to get elevated in rank, and so. Well, is that guy carrying something? And so that becomes a real concern for guys and guys and women. Absolutely. Yeah, you don't want to be someone a complainer. You don't want to be perceived as weak, someone who is unstable, quote unquote.
Yeah.
So the professional elevation is definitely a consideration, along with the kind of general code of a warrior who is strong is not weak. So
you just deal with it.
Deal with it. Yeah. So I think there's more resources that exist. In terms of access to psychologists, there's a better culture around it, but it's not perfect for sure.
Far from perfect. I mean, I think a lot of this money that's going into the war machine needs to be. I think Bernie was recently saying, if you think it's too expensive to take care of veterans, don't send them to war. I mean, it's part of the process. I mean, if these guys are going to go and these men and women are going to go into these situations, we got to be there on both ends. And one of the stats that came up in the film is 22 vets a day commit suicide. That's so disturbing. And so this probably has motivated you. Not only is it, you're obviously proud of the film and everything, but it's got to be motivating to get out there and help spread the word through this film.
This is not a faddish issue. We have a military that's going to be engaged at all times, and we have a veteran population that is, it's not just the last deployment that came home. It's the entire Iraq, Afghanistan, theater, of veterans. There is, still people who are enlisted who are dealing with these issues who are not out of the Army or the other military branches, and then there's the Middle East veterans from the 90s.
Yeah.
There's all the Vietnam veterans that
they weren't cared for properly when they came
not
back.
It wasn't the PTSD didn't even exist as a term until 1980. 1980 it was introduced to the DSM. So
everyone knew they were messed up. They just never identified it and started.
And that's why you saw the rampant rates of alcoholism. And that 22 veterans a day that commit suicide. I don't know what the breakdown is demographically, but I imagine a good portion of that are Vietnam veterans. It's not just the Iraq, Afghanistan. Yes. This is the survivors of all the wars. So that includes Korea. The waning numbers of World War II. Probably, I don't think there's almost no World War I veterans alive. But so that includes all veterans of all wars. But those are the World War II and Korea and Vietnam veterans are a part of that population that are completely underserved. Yeah. And at this point, they're
at least now we're making some sort of progress towards identifying and making help. So that's encouraging.
Yeah,
I'd like to see how involved Senator Al Franken was in the whole thing. And for those who haven't seen the film, it's there is a dog plays a big part of it. His name's Tuesday, who helps Luis deal with his things. He's given a dog and. Al Franken was involved with the Service Dogs for Veteran Act, which was I was very happy to see that. Were you surprised? I was surprised on how you were listing and pointing out all the benefits of a dog for PTSD. That was pretty remarkable.
It's incredible. It's funny. I was just on the phone today with Lou Picard, who runs ECAD, which is the organization, the nonprofit that trains the dogs, service dogs, and the dog with whom Louise trained with. I was on the phone with her today. She's a huge dog person, but she understands better than anyone the benefits, literally the life-saving benefits of a service dog for veterans or for anyone with a traumatic brain injury or a traumatic emotional injury, and so. I'm not surprised. I mean, I had a dog as a kid, and so I didn't. It was that bond is strong, and how comforting that is. Just in your heart. You don't even think about it in kind of physiological terms, but your heart rate goes down. You chill when you have your dog, and then. But I spent a lot of time with Louise.
I would cuddle with my dog on the ground, and just it was very cathartic.
Now add that if a dog is trained to be able to be in tune with your heart rate, to be in tune with your sweating.
That's what kind of blew my mind when they were saying that they could almost sense their heart rate going up and prevent a panic attack, or you're about to have a crippling nightmare, and then they could sense that and come. I mean, the level kind of blew my mind a little bit. Not that I wasn't in tune with what a dog can provide, but that's pretty intense.
It's really intense, and just imagine how comforting it is if obviously sleep hygiene is a huge thing for anyone's mental health. So if you come back, just sleep hygiene, meaning are you able to get 6, 7, 8 hours of sleep with some regularity? If you're sleeping on
insomnia is a big part of many people's PTSD.
Well, insomnia is a result of invasive thoughts, nightmares, just a hypervigilance, not trusting your environment. Like you're still in battle mode, but even if you're in a civilian context, so if you and I are sitting in the studio and I hear something go outside and I think I'm misinterpreting that as a threat, I'm not going to sleep. I'm going to be upright, aware, like I was as a soldier. And so the dog enables you to kind of pacify that hypervigilance, actually get some rest, and if you get that rest, that is it's just a very common basic thing of healing.
And experience on a basic level some unconditional love too. I mean, that's one thing that dogs give. It's really remarkable.
And what a foundation builder for rebuilding your other relationships in your life. Yeah, exactly. So I can trust this dog. This dog is dependable.
Someone else I might be able to trust.
Right, that existential notion exists in your life again. Let me extend that a step further to a parent, a sibling, a friend, a colleague, a platoon mate,
like
something.
Gateway drug to trust.
That's a great way to put it.
And Luis, he wrote a book. It's called Until Tuesday: Wounded Warrior and the Golden Retriever Who Saved Him, which I'm looking forward to read. That it must have been, and you got to see some of it in the film. That must have been pretty intense to write. Not only is it cathartic, but as he was saying, reliving those experiences, trying to really draw him out of himself. That's intense.
Super intense. And Luis is so fastidious and so exacting that I know he didn't shy away from re-examining those periods of his life.
Yeah.
And, he retells the incidents of trauma and then the re-traumatization, in terms of, and I don't want to give away the book, but,
sure.
the idea that, once you're deployed, you have an obligation to your platoon. But at the same time, he always felt an obligation to the Iraqis. And he knew that the policy choices at the time were creating a massive refugee crisis. And he was stationed in Al-Anbar, Western Iraq. This is like the heart of where the ISIS battle is happening now. So he was seeing the seeds of all of that. This kind of policy, again, not observing tribal rhythms and cultures. Kind of the vacuum that happens when it's sucked out and the corruption takes over. And so he was seeing all this in the front lines, and he was aware, even though he was an officer in the Army, that this is a humanitarian crisis, not just a veteran crisis that we're leaving behind. And so that I think that really weighed on him as well. And so he's someone that has a great deal of compassion, a great deal of empathy, and is kind of multicultural way. And so leaving Iraq and choosing to leave the Army was very, very difficult. He had to for his own literal survival.
He chose to leave.
Yeah, he was honorably discharged. He chose to leave the Army. He wasn't being, I think he broke with it philosophically, but also they weren't supporting him in a way that was benefiting his his spiritual and kind of psychic structure. And knew at this point in his life he could do more good on the outside, but being on the outside became very difficult. You lost an institution he knew since he was 17. Now he's thrust into a civilian life with none of the tethers. And civilian life doesn't work like the military. He's used to clockwork, precision, a chain of command, and you have to operate in the civilian world where all those structures fall apart. It was very, very challenging.
Yeah, that's so intense. To kind of circle towards Ashley in New Orleans, you spent a great amount of time in New Orleans during the filming?
During and before. That was the reason, in part, I wanted to do a New Orleans story, is that a very good friend of mine from college was from New Orleans, and so she took us all back there for jazz fests, for first music festivals, really fun stuff. I had great times, but, I got a real sense of how important that city was to her in a way that I didn't have an attachment like that to any geography in my own life. So when Katrina happened, she was living in New York, I was living in New York, and we went up to Columbia to see Alan Toussaint sing and perform afterwards. So amazing. And just the tears being shed is a lament for the destruction of the city. So I wanted very much to participate in a small way to kind of keep that story alive, to keep New Orleans on people's minds and the consciousness as it went forward. And it coincided with the film I was developing later on, obviously with Buried Above Ground, to look at what does aftermath look like.
So that planted the seed for where you went with.
Yeah, I mean, how was I? How could I help that situation? What knowing that there's gonna be a huge response. To any tragedy or trauma, there's a huge response initially, and things fade, cameras go away, the tension
exactly
tension shifts. So here, how could I contribute to that attention staying on there? And so that this was a choice to do it that way.
You were just alluding to it that was pretty intense. Was not only Ashley dealing with her own personal struggle, but the pain of the city. I mean, there is, like you just said, that attachment people have to that city, and part of her broken heart and part of her fear and everything was that it would happen again to this place that she loved so much. So that's why it's a fascinating thing to see what happened down there.
It's a complicated town. It's a complicated town because it's like the choice is to be there, fine, but there's a known quantity that the levees aren't structurally sound. Yeah. We have climate change. The marshes are being destroyed by oil spill. So all of there's no good reason to stay in New Orleans.
Yeah.
It's gonna happen probably again. And
she's preparing herself for that.
Absolutely.
The weather witch.
The weather witch, right? Her box of preparedness.
Her survival kit, pretty
survival
much.
Kit.
Pretty, to say the least.
But you see the size of it, and the size of it lends to her heart, and her heart is community facing. She has enough food and supplies in there to not just take care of her, her and her family, but rather, her neighbor, whoever needs the help, she's preparing to be that person who can help all those people.
Ashley, she was, it was incredible to see how strong she was. And it was incredible to see how strong all three of them were. I mean, that they were really fighting so hard to gain back control of their lives. And so that was something that really struck me in the film. That was real good. Can you say her name again?
Arundina.
Arundina. In her case, and a very complex case, that she was a domestic violence situation, we spent some time with her son, too. And what was unique for me to see was to start to understand how PTSD can kind of trickle down through the family. Is that something you...
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that there's a generational component to PTSD. So there's, it's something where I think Arundina was the subject of child abuse from her father to start, but also witnessed her father being abusive towards her mother.
Yeah,
so she internalizes that, perhaps, I would hedge to say normalizes that, but that has an impact. And so what happens in her life, she becomes involved with partners who become physically abusive and verbally abusive, psychologically abusive, multiple situations. And is it something that she's normalized, she's rationalized? Okay, this is what love looks like.
Yeah.
A lot of things happened along those lines. And so what does her son witness? Her son witnesses multiple partners that are abusive towards his mother. Yeah. So that becomes something that he has to process.
Even
and that's
before you kind of mentioned how it was affecting him, that's just going through my mind. I mean, he walked in, his mother was about to get hit one time. He found her almost drowning in the tub. I kept thinking this could cause an issue like that, and then
Absolutely.
you delve into it, and that's these things resonate. It is such a complex.
No, I think resonate is right, and it resonates on a lot of levels. I mean, it resonates, psychologically, behaviorally, but even physically. Like, imagine as a little boy or a girl witnessing this, and the tension, the stress you're carrying in your body. You're literally taking on a physical component of that, and so, the deleterious effects of that kind of physical stress on top of this kind of psychic and spiritual stress. It's a huge negative impact on kids. No wonder kids, from that experience or community, have trouble in school. What are they thinking about? They're thinking about what happened last night.
On these little, how does math matter when at home mom's getting hurt or
you're like, okay, when's the bell gonna ring? I have to head home back to that environment.
Exactly.
And you haven't slept all night because you were hearing this, or you're afraid, daddy or mommy or somebody's or an uncle or somebody's coming into your room that night. Again, the hypervigilance manifests in the kids, and it becomes a really, again, and they're like the most powerless. There's lack of verbal ways to express it, the he said, she said, trust factor, the power issue, and then if it's a community in poverty, what are the little resources? In an overcrowded school, is there a social worker who's willing to
focus on this
find that kid with that issue, not confuse the acting out, the anger with some other special ed need, or and miscasting the kid. And so but if you look, if you dig into these kids' narratives, if you have the time and resources, you'll find, trauma sometimes, very often, is at the core of it, but expressed in all these other things that are treated with disciplinarian things. And as you get older and older, that becomes juvie and jail, as opposed to, social work, therapy, and other resources.
Exactly.
And really, I'm really biased against, kids from disadvantaged backgrounds.
Yeah, I mean, and just speaking of disadvantage, she had no health insurance. She couldn't afford therapy. This is the lack of resources to deal with this problem, and not just for veterans coming home, for people dealing with it in everyday life. There's not enough.
There's not enough, and the cynical thing is to say is, okay, well, she earned this experience. She's making these choices and putting herself in the situation. And you talk about things like universal health care, not to get on a soapbox, but preventative care, if there's ways to intervene, and same with education. If there's ways to intervene early, this person who is now out of the workforce for 15 years, dependent on social services and ER visits, all of these things that are costing taxpayers money in a really, kind of clinical way, or economically clinical way, you could say, you could save a lot of money by early intervention. Early intervention in education, early intervention in social and mental health services. Disrupt these cycles, and obviously you get into a situation with substance abuse. The compounded effect on a community, on an economy is it's massive because you're taking from the resources, you're not contributing, and you're also disrupting your family, like you said. We spoke about this generational, resonance of trauma. If you're not caretaking in your family, what is the legacy of that? Is that kid going on to then participate in a negative way in society? So there's a lot of things to do, but those are long lead institutional reforms that don't sound so good in a presidential year to discuss and take on and see through. But those are the kind of systemic things that you hope awareness and public will turns into political will.
Powerful in that way, and I mean, but you're right. There's an incredible snowball effect, and that if these things are addressed at a earlier point, it doesn't have to go that way. In some ways, there's a point in film where there's a surprising relapse, and it kind of just made you realize how someone who is fighting PTSD, this process. It's a constant thing. It's a lifelong struggle. Am I right? You're always going to be.
I think you're pointing out a really good thing. Is it's both a lifelong struggle, but manageable in ways that produce great outcomes. Your life changes. You're not the same person you were, but you can find new, fulfilling, perhaps even more fulfilling ways to live a happy life. And I think you also point out the challenge in the filmmaking from a story point, but also the challenge for each of the subjects in the film is that it's not this kind of graph linear trajectory towards recovery. That it comes with dips and valleys, crests and troughs, relapses, setbacks, and you kind of keep pushing forward.
They're out of it a little bit.
Yeah,
and it's right there.
Right, and then and like the fragility of it. So having so think about the task of living life where you want to be looking forward at the same time knowing that the edge, falling off the edge, is always a possibility, and so. There's a vigilance you have to live your life with, and but
you always have to be on. You're always on task.
On task, on point, and that's hard. It's a hard way to have to live. Sometimes
Absolutely.
It's easier just to say, give your hands up, say, I don't want to fight anymore.
We were talking about the student at school. They can't focus on that. How do you focus on a lot of life tasks when you are focusing so much effort on controlling this issue?
Well, I have one answer for you, and that's community.
Community, right?
Like that's the kind of the operative phrase we've used around the film is, and I've borrowed it, stolen it, whatever, from the journalist Sebastian Junger, who wrote The Perfect Storm, directed the documentary Restrepo, and he's a war journalist, and he's been all over the world with embedded in Afghanistan. He's a super courageous guy, and
to say the least.
And he has witnessed PTSD far more closely than I have, but he's used this phrase "crisis of connection," which I think is a really important thing. And he's written about it, and one of the things he talks about is what our old familial institutions look like when we had multiple generations living together, care providing, so uncles, aunts, grandmothers, and so our family structures have changed, so our care for each other has changed. But so with PTSD, there's a crisis of connection because you isolate, you withdraw, you distrust people, but community can help keep you on point, can keep you reminded of what you need to do and reminded of your worth, remind you that you don't have to be ashamed, embarrassed, that help mitigate the negative effects of stigma. So community is a real key. Now, not everyone has that, and especially if you've been acting out as a result of
your actions have pushed people away, which is very common.
Very common, and then you compound it with perhaps a comorbidity with substance abuse, and you've now you're been in and out of rehab, or you've stolen money. You've done things to get through your addiction. It's a big challenge. It's it's easier said than done to say to restore your community, but it really takes that. It really it's not something that can be done alone. But I also think that non-cynically that people do forgive, and that communities will come together, or you find new communities. That it's something that's fluid and that can change, and that so to focus on that hope.
People understand the root causes. They can find ways to forgive and find ways to try to help, and I mean, awareness is a key word that I'm going to go back to a couple times as we conclude the talk. But while the film it's tough at times and it's powerful in this way, there's such a spirit in it and in all the subjects, and this fashions the film very inspiring and beautiful. And at one point, Louis says, you have to fight to be happy, and I will not go softly. I will not go gently into that good night. And And I feel that you crafted this film to honor this will and this spirit, and to prove that, with helps, lives can change for the better. As you said, this was one of the goals.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, and inspired by them, like you said, because it wasn't, none of their outcomes were predicted. When I met Luis, he was holed up in his apartment in Sunset Park. It was before he got into Service Dog. Would I have guessed he wrote a New York Times best-selling book, that he'd be an advocate on the road?
That you see him on stage with Al Franken and
David Letterman, and that's the famous stuff. But the grinding work he does when he's in community libraries. He's written 2 children's books, or he wrote 1 children's book, and he's got a second one coming out in June.
Are they all involved Tuesday?
All involved Tuesday, and it's brilliant. It's like, okay, he's got this memoir about his life that adults read. But who needs to be sensitized about mental health and veterans and service dogs? Children. So if they're growing up with this normalized, okay, that there's someone with a disability and a service dog, oh, that's just part of my community. Or there's a veteran, what do? Oh, they fought for this country. They come back. I got to think about them in a more sympathetic way. Yeah. Or they came back and they've changed. But how do they change? Well, they look at the world a little differently now. I can accept that in my life. Like, that's a pretty impactful thing to go school to school, library to library, to try to sensitize a generation of children. That's a very ambitious and a very positive message. I never would have guessed that for Luis. And then for Arundina, like, I met her, she was 4 years sober. I thought she was on her way to graduate, get her GED, associates.
At 40.
At 40.
Really
like,
battling through it.
Yeah, just balling out, being like, you know what, I'm going for it. I'm going to be a therapist too. And then she took a very, very different route to that. Yeah. I still think she's going to do that. It's going to take a little bit longer, but that's not an outcome I predicted with her at all.
Sure.
And so, you can't predict the outcomes, but when each of these subjects found community, it liberated them to take steps forward in their own recovery and refine. I guess the other thing that they found were purpose. Finding purpose, new purpose, and when you have that to pull you through every day. Why did this happen to me?
We talked about that a lot. Finding a reason to propel and move on.
He had the Army for so long. It was mission to mission to mission, and there's a grand institution providing that purpose, and all of a sudden.
Besides all the trauma of war, that fallout from that system that pushes, like a kind of a loose analogy, like a ball player. When they finish, their sports career, then like, what's next?
What's next? Right.
What's next? What do you do?
And then to make the analogy even clearer, is like if you left a professional league and then they stopped supporting you and kind of shunned you a little bit, forgot about you for a minute, made it harder for you to live as a civilian or as a non-professional. That kind of institutional betrayal, you're getting over that and then refinding a new purpose. And so again, that's. Another kind of heroic component of Luis is finding new purpose, and his particular purpose is to advocate and educate, and bring hope. That's a pretty noble, grandiose thing, and he's pulling it off, and he's executing it. So
and you're just seeing how difficult it is to get to that point where he was able to give back. It's so admirable. It's really touching. Really touching. Back to you a little bit as a filmmaker. The other film of yours that you were involved in that I saw was the documentary "The Carrier," which that affected me pretty deeply as well, very deeply. In that you brought us into a remote African
Zambia, yep.
Village to show how intensely AIDS was ravaging its people, and it's incredible how socially conscious your films are. And I was curious, is there anything else on your mind? I mean, what's next, if you will? I mean, it's.
Well, with the Carrier, I work with director Maggie Betts on that, and she'd worked with the UN quite a bit and UNICEF, and so they were partners in helping make that film happen.
Yeah, the access you had to that village was pretty intense.
Well,
how long did that documentary take place?
We shot. We were following a pregnant Zambian woman who is HIV positive, trying to employ some of the mother to child prevention measures that have been put in place in local and rural clinics to prevent their child from having the HIV transmission being intervened. And so we followed her. We met her probably. When she was 3 or 4 months pregnant, and we came back every month, through her pregnancy and delivery, which we were there for, which was wild. And then, to really look at, and complicated by the fact that she was in a polygamous marriage, where the husband was HIV positive, and the two other wives were as well, and so looking at how to carry on in that world. So social issues. So that was Maggie Betts' vision that I came in to help produce, and we lived in Zambia for 4 months making that film.
Wow.
And what's next? I'm not quite sure. I mean,
you're in the thick of this.
I'm in the thick of this. Yeah. I mean, I think that it leads us to the hopes for Buried Above Ground are to have a national broadcast, which looks very likely June 28th, the day after PTSD Awareness Day.
Yeah.
So in June is PTSD Awareness Month, and so we're looking at a broadcast with PBS World Channel, which we're extremely proud and happy with.
Good.
As well as a number. Yeah, it's going to be and PBS is great. It's the most accessible station and platform in the country, both in mobile and on television. It's just people have access to it, as well as a number of other distributors that are going to come in to get it on digital platforms and into community screenings. We're building robust toolkits for people to host their own screenings of any scale, and trying to employ other sponsors to help promote getting the film into all kinds of spaces at any scale. Again, like if it's a 5-person screening, that's 5 more people that are perhaps a little more sensitized. If it's a 150-person screening, and we've done events from 5 people to 250, while doing the film festival routes and being and working with other mental health advocacy groups to try to, in a really grassroots, conscientious way, community by community, build, use the film to build a conversation around disrupting the crisis of connection that we see as the kind of most immediate impact any person can have with someone with PTSD or someone in their community with PTSD. Just connect, a little bit of compassion.
Message. If you wanted people to walk away from this film, it's that connection, that understanding.
You don't have to be a clinical psychologist. You don't have to prescribe anything. You don't have to be a therapist. Just be available, and that is a huge opportunity. It's something that anyone can do, and it's not the complete therapeutic approach, but man, does it go a long way to say, you don't have to be embarrassed. You don't have to be ashamed. I'm here. I can listen. I got you. And so that's a great start.
Something, the gift to yourself is something anyone can give if they're willing. But you have to know. You have to be aware that this person is. You might not be able to understand the entirety of it. These things are complex. What someone goes through is complex. But to understand they're hurting. So it's. Like Louis says, he states that so many people don't have a clue, both on the battlefield and in the everyday, and he's so right. And it's remarkable to me and scary to think about how many people are walking around kind of in this shell shock, shook state from these life experiences, and you just never know what people are going through or what someone has gone through, and it's so important to remember this, and this is just one of the reasons I think your film is so important. And knowledge is power, empathy is power, but more than that, people need help. We need the word out, and we as a society need to do more. So, and I think your film really makes this clear. Buried Above Ground really makes this clear. So, thank you so much for coming here and talking to me.
Cool. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah. I really appreciate being on here.
Great. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
Yeah. Across the Margin.
Across the Margin podcast.